Evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. It's November 5th. Oh, what a week. What a weekend. We have so much to talk about. I realize I open every show by saying, hey, we have so much to talk about. One day I would love to be able to open a show and say, good evening, everybody. Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. I'm your host, Nate Pike. We've got one thing to talk about. Today, a puppy was sad. But unfortunately, that's not looking to be on the horizon for the province of Alberta anytime soon. We're here for it, though. We're going to keep showing up because that's what we do. And we're going to start with sort of a good news context story that's really important for some of the discussions that are going on in the province of Alberta right now. We're talking about renewables. We're talking about energy. We're talking about solar. We're talking about a new report from the policy school out of the University of Calgary. They did a little bit of research to say, hey, what would it take, hypothetically speaking, if we wanted to have Alberta net zero energy? Everybody keeps talking about the high value agricultural land. Oh my gosh. How much agricultural land would the province of Alberta have to give up? They did a whole report. They did a whole infographic. And in that infographic included this little infographic right here where it talked about Alberta land use by type compared to a potential solar footprint. And when you take a look at the graphic, if you're listening on the Twitter Spaces, you should look at the graphic. It's also on our Twitter, the X Spaces. It's a little tiny little box. It is less than 1/10 of 1% of all agricultural land would be required to host a net zero solar future. If they only used high value, so the best of the best agricultural land, if that's all they said, you know what, we're gonna take up all of the land that is the truly cream of the crop, no pun intended, land, all of the land that everybody's so worried about, how much would it take? It would take 3%. 3% of all high-value agricultural land, if that's only the land that was focused on. But if they just say, hey, we're going to put it up, it is less than 1/10 of 1% of all agricultural land in order to host a net zero solar future. Now, this just goes to show how much of a tempest in a teapot the whole issue has become. And even when we've heard the Premier, Danielle Smith, talking about the issue and how she has to drive past the solar panels, it's worth remembering those solar panels have been installed on industrial land. The solar panels out near Brooks, those are not solar panels on high-value agricultural land. So it's really important to take a step back and take these things into context. And it's really great that the policy school, which is a extraordinarily reputable group of education. There's my word salad for the night. There's going to be lots of that tonight, not just for me. They're very well researched, very well reputable. And so the fact that they did this work and figured out the actual math for what it would take for Alberta to go to a net zero future is really quite important. And it's something that should be taken into the appropriate amount of context. We wanted to open with that because it's good news. Things aren't as bad as they seem in regards to solar. In regards to just about everything else, though, oh boy, we got us some problems in the province. This week, the legislature back in session, started up, hitting the ground running on the 30th, Monday, the throne speech. And there's some important things to take into consideration for the conversation that we're about to have here about the throne speech, because there were a lot of people who watched the throne speech. They watched the lieutenant governor and they said, hey, wait a second. Why is she reading it? Why is this person reading the throne speech? Did she write it? Is she the one telling the government what to do? And no, that's not how it works at all. The government, so the UCP, write the speech and she reads the speech. And there were some parts of the speech that were pretty wild. And they telegraphed a lot of the things that we're going to see happening in the legislature over the coming weeks and probably months. We're going to start with the first clip. She talked about And this is a clip that we maybe we tried to speed it up a little bit. Her reading pace was good for short clips. For long clips, it's a little long. There's some very long pauses in how she reads the throne speech. So we went ahead and we sped it up a little bit. That's the only edit that we've made to this clip. But when it comes to the Sovereignty Act, a lot of people have been saying, hey, when is this thing going to get rolled out? And it looks like it's going to get rolled out fairly soon.
Are powerful forces in our country, including in the federal government, that believe our province must fundamentally alter our provincial economy and way of life, and that we must do so without delay or concern of cost. These individuals believe that developing Alberta's natural resources is inconsistent with reducing global emissions. They intend to enforce this belief by effectively capping emissions and therefore production of our oil and natural gas sector, which will cost Alberta hundreds of thousands of jobs and hundreds of billions of dollars in economic investment and provincial revenues. These same individuals believe that our province must also fundamentally transform our power grid to be net zero within approximately a decade, with risk to the reliability of Alberta's power grid and at a cost of hundreds of billions of dollars to Alberta ratepayers. And they seek to impose these policies on our province, knowing full well the Canadian Constitution grants our province exclusive jurisdiction over the development of our natural resources and operation of our provincial electrical grid. Honourable members, Alberta's government will not permit the federal government to inflict these destructive policies on the people of Alberta. If the federal government continues down its current path, Alberta's government will, over the coming months, introduce several motions under the Sovereignty Within a United Canada Act, detailing provincial initiatives and legislation necessary to protect Albertans from these unconstitutional and harmful policies.
There we go. It's happening. Said right there in the throne speech. If the federal government doesn't back down on an emissions cap, if they don't back down on net zero within a couple of months, weeks and months, then we're going to see the Sovereignty Act, multiple motions under the Sovereignty Act rolled out to say to the feds, hey, we made this legislation that most people have decried as being completely unconstitutional, and it's probably going to get defeated on the first court challenge, but we're going to roll it out anyway. Sovereignty Act is coming to a legislature near you. For context, I know that clip felt a little bit long. That was at 25% faster speed. She's a very paced speaker. But there were some other things that came up as well. One of the big questions that a lot of people have been wondering about is the UCP campaigned heavily on the idea of forced treatment, or taking people who somebody subjectively decides has an issue with mental health or addictions, and saying, hey, even though you don't meet the qualifiers that already exist for somebody to be detained and treated against their will, we're going to create this whole new category that they're calling compassionate intervention, because they're compassionately removing somebody's charter rights to self-determination. But it's cool because it's being done compassionately, I guess. A lot of people have been wondering, hey, is that coming? And in the throne speech, the answer was a resounding yes.
While Albertans are looking for consequences for criminals, our hearts also break as we see so many falling into the deadly and destructive trap of addiction and untreated mental health issues. In many instances, these Albertans have become a danger to themselves and others in the community. That is one of the reasons why Alberta's government will introduce legislation to create a compassionate intervention program for those who have lost the capacity to make life-saving decisions and are a danger to themselves or others.
Now, again, it's really important to highlight that the criteria of whether or not somebody is a danger to themselves or to others is already in place. That already exists for people who are exhibiting that they're a danger to themselves or to others. They can be taken in under a variety of mental health forms if they lack capacity. But what they're talking about here isn't taking somebody who lacks capacity. They're talking about people who, for whatever reason, are choosing to use a variety of different drugs. And because those people are using those drugs too much, they're going to create this compassionate intervention piece that will allow them to detain people against their will and force them into treatment. Now, we've talked about this many times on the show. We're going to be talking about it more because it simply can't be said enough. Forced treatment doesn't work. It doesn't work. All of the evidence speaks to that. We've had guests on the show who have lived experience, and they've all said it doesn't work. The only thing that forced treatment or compassionate intervention does is it gives people who don't have a working knowledge or a working understanding of what addiction is and how it can be treated a sense of control. And at the end of the day, the whole compassionate treatment piece is about nothing more than control. It's not about helping people. It's not about meeting people where they are. It's about controlling them. And it's fascinating, and this will be a theme as we go through the evening, rest assured. It's fascinating that this is the approach that a provincial government that campaigned on freedom has been choosing to implement. But that wasn't the only thing. That wasn't the only piece that came up. There were some strong words about energy and power, and there's a lot to unpack. What you're about to hear is 3 clips that were put together because otherwise we'd all be here for an hour.
It is the Alberta government's position that our world will have little hope of meaningfully reducing carbon emissions without Alberta multiplying its natural gas and other energy exports to Asia and other jurisdictions to replace the world's use of coal, wood, and other high-emitting sources for energy. And increasing our exports can guarantee energy security for the free world while replacing thousands of megatons of carbon dioxide from coal and other high-emission fuels with clean Alberta LNG and responsibly developed oil products. Albertans' electricity costs are too high, honourable members. There are many reasons for this. A rushed provincial transition from coal to natural gas and federal policies that are scaring away new investment in electricity generation from natural gas are the primary culprits.
There's so much to unpack in those sections. Now, again, that's 3 sections, but it's really worth doing the compare and contrast because in the first 2 clips, we've got the UCP government in their throne speech, because again, it's the UCP government who wrote the speech. Our liquid natural gas, it's the best stuff. So carbon friendly. We got to get it to the rest of the world because we got to displace all of that horrid coal. Oh, that coal, it's so bad. And then in the same speech, they're complaining about having to get rid of coal in Alberta. And they're trying to pin high electricity prices on the fact that we got rid of coal to power our electrical power generation things, which is really interesting because the question came up not too long ago. Hey, Danielle Smith, you've got this fun little radio show that you do. Could you maybe speak to, maybe address what's going on with the electricity prices? Spoiler alert, she didn't say coal.
Asked the Premier why Alberta's electricity rates have increased 128% in 1 year compared to 12% in Saskatchewan. Alberta also has the highest price per 75 kilowatt hours. Why is this? We deserve to know the truth, and that is from Kevin.
We certainly do, and that's why I've got my electricity minister and Nathan Neudorf working on that. One of the things that changed a few years ago is this concept of economic withholding. It's a complicated topic to raise, but essentially it allows for generators to hold back a little bit of the power so that the price goes up so that they can sell it at a price that allows them to make money. And when we looked at this before, we never used to allow this. When they looked at it in 2020, the market surveillance administrator didn't think that there was a problem. And so they said, well, this is a legitimate practice. And now what we have seen is, unfortunately, I think too much power is being held back. Prices are escalating too much, and we're all paying the price for it. So we've begun the conversation of how we address that, because we have a problem with the market design. There's no question about it. When the regulated rate option surges to 32 cents a kilowatt hour, that's a sign that something's broken. When distribution and transmission charges are the highest charge on your bill, higher even than your electricity charges, that's a sign that something's broken. And we're working right now not only on the pause so that we can get good policy around wind and solar, adding them to the grid, doing reclamation, but we're looking at these other aspects as well, because we need to have reliable power. We need to have affordable power. That's got to be one of the things that draw people here as an Alberta advantage. And right now, it's not the case, and we're going to make sure that we address it.
Craziest thing. Danielle Smith back in August was asked, "Hey, Danny, why are the electricity prices so high?" And Danielle Smith was, "Well, it's this economic withholding thing." And she's 100% right. We've had multiple people on the show that have spoken to how economic withholding does, in fact, allow power generating companies to hold back generation, which drives the price up, and they make more money. They don't need to hold back that power, but if they do, they make more money. Now, this was a policy that the UCP actually brought in. So to be very, very clear, according to more than a few power experts, cough David Gray, and a bunch of economists, the primary reason that Alberta's electricity is in some cases 4 times higher than other provinces is because of a policy that the UCP brought in. But that's not what the throne speech was about. The throne speech was about oil and gas and championing for Alberta energy. So they couldn't exactly say, hey, you know what? Electricity prices, boy, they suck. You're welcome. Because that probably wouldn't have landed. So instead, some intrepid speechwriter decided to say, we got rid of the coal too quickly. But the throne speech was just the beginning, because the very next day, we got into the bills. Oh, the bills. So many bills. The bills have come due. There have been a total of 7 bills that we're likely to see so far in this legislative session. Now, we're going to talk about each of them kind of in order, not necessarily they were introduced, but in numerical order, because that makes a bit more sense, because there's been a lot of speculation, and there's certainly some of the bills that have gotten a lot of attention because of what they're aiming to do. So we're going to spend the next 15, 20 minutes talking about what the bills are, what they seem to be trying to do, and what the implications are for Albertans. We're going to start with the first bill, which is Bill 1. This is Danielle Smith's big bill. She campaigned on this bill. It's the how to hobble a government for the future, at least until somebody decides to change the legislation bill. No, I got that wrong. It's the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Act. Basically, what the Alberta Taxpayer Protection Act does is it says, hey, you know what? If there's going to be any increases in income taxes, there has to be a referendum. We're going to make this a law. It has to be a referendum. Now, this is a fascinating choice because referendums aren't cheap. And what this effectively does is it means that if at any point the government needs to play with the levers of how they get income, let's say that oil takes a sudden drop in price and all of a sudden those revenues disappear, it's going to be the choice of, well, we got to raise taxes or we got to cut services. And that's a decision that's going to go to referendum now. Now, where this gets complicated is it all depends on the government of the day. So Danielle Smith has presented this bill by saying, hey, you know what? This bill is going to make sure we never see taxes increased in the province of Alberta without a referendum. It's going to be the law. And that's technically true. But as we've seen with multiple successive governments, all you have to do to change the law is write a new law or just repeal the old one. That's it. It just takes a government that says, oh, hey, don't like how that one planned out. Let's just scratch that one off the books there. Don't have to campaign on it. You'd probably get in a lot of trouble if you did, but it's not a binding for perpetuity type thing. So that's Bill 1. Kind of a bit of a nothing burger, but Danielle Smith's centerpiece bill. It's the one that she talked about the most. Moving on from there, we got to go to Bill 2. This is the Alberta Pension Act. And this is the act that sets the framework for a referendum or the possibilities of an Alberta pension plan. And this is where, again, things start to get a little bit complicated. So what the bill, the Alberta Pension Act, is saying is that Albertans must vote in favor of an Alberta pension plan during a public referendum before the government withdraws assets from the Canada Pension Plan to establish an APP. So what this act would say is that the government of Alberta can't unilaterally just say, screw it, CPP, we're going our own way, which technically they can kind of do right now. So that's not an entirely bad thing to say. There's got to be a vote. And then it sort of reiterates the same rules that exist in order for anyone to leave the CPP anyways. Contribution rates under an APP would be the same or lower than the rates for the CPP. An APP must provide the same or better benefits to Albertans. And then this is where it gets really interesting. The entire asset transferred from a CPP to Alberta would be used solely to set up and operate an APP. Now, where it gets interesting is it's that particular chunk of the bill that the government has pointed to and said, see, we can't direct it because it's got to be used in operating an APP. So you can't just, give $100 million to Joe's Oil Company because that's not operating an APP right up until the point where somebody decides that that's an investment that might make money for Albertans. And then potentially it could be. So there's a little bit of word salad that needs to be sorted out with this bill because depending on the interpretation of it, there is an argument very easily to be made that it makes it look like the government couldn't direct funds for other programs, but at the same time, if it was hedged under an investment and the operations of an APP, then the government could potentially bring those changes forward. So a lot of questions to be cleared up with that one. Moving on from there, we're getting up to Bill 3. Now, Bill 3 is a giant nothing burger. There was a lot of people who were really scared about Bill 3 because it was is titled the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Recovery Act. And there were some people who were speculating that maybe what this bill is about is they're going to Marshall Smith style force people to work allegedly, to keep their spot in their addiction centers or their addiction treatment centers. Maybe this is going to be a way to force people to do that. And that's not what the bill is at all. This is another bill that's a bit of a nothing burger because the reality of it is that what this bill accomplishes is it changes a little bit of the terminology that exists in a bill that was brought forward a few years ago in order to allow the Alberta government to sue, to be part of a lawsuit against some of the companies and corporations that introduced products like OxyContin. Now, a little bit of a history lesson that gets to be important for context. OxyContin was originally brought to market, and one of the companies involved was a company called Purdue Pharma. The marketing that went into making sure that OxyContin was heavily prescribed hinged on the idea that there's no way that people can get addicted to this particular opiate. Now, obviously, that's not true. And a lot of people look at the opioid epidemic that is currently raging across North America and has been for years, and they say, hey, OxyContin was really the gasoline that got thrown on it that got so many people hooked because people were being prescribed OxyContin for chronic pain management. People were being prescribed OxyContin when they were dealing with injuries or when they were dealing with coming out of surgeries. And it hooked them. And of course, we've seen the escalation of opioids since that time, where it went from things like OxyContin to fentanyl, and from fentanyl to some of the other analogs that are now floating around. It was the introduction of this bill, though, that saw a couple of very interesting moments in a press conference. We'll get to those in just a sec. But basically what the bill does is it defines what an active ingredient is. It includes consultants and wholesalers and manufacturers in the broad term of the original bill, basically just to widen the net of who can be sued to try to recover costs from these massive pharmaceutical companies. That's what it is. But it came with a press conference, and we had Dan, I like to drink inside of the legislative chamber, and I wish I was joking because he did do that. Saw him step up to the mic, and it turned into quite a wild little press conference. He had some thoughts that he wanted to share. The first clip that we're going to play for you now is the thoughts that he had on safe supply.
Janet, you had your hand up.
Yes. I just want to go back to a comment that you have made this comparison that people who want to provide safe supply are somehow on par with the manufacturers of opioids that you're saying were misleading and trying to profit off of people's suffering. Can you just expand a little bit on that? Do you really think that that's a fair comparison, that people who are trying to run safe supply programs are trying to profit off of people with addictions?
I think that the nature of the first attempt at safe supply through oxycodone or Oxycontin, where they said that public access or wide access to opioids is a public health benefit. They said that they're non-addictive, that being concerned with the overprescription or abuse is opioid phobia is the same thing that's happening now with safe supply. And there's no policy reason to think that whether the provider is the pharmaceutical industry or it is the federal government, that a mass expansion of supply of opioids is going to have a different policy outcome. We are in this lawsuit today and joining it because of widespread prescription of opioids that were massively damaging to the health of Albertans and a burden on our system. And there is no substantive difference to whether or not that supply came from opioid manufacturers, distributors, wholesalers, or whether it comes through from the federal government.
Now, Dan's wrong. Let's just get that out of the way. Dan's wrong in a bunch of different ways, but let's talk about why Dan's wrong. So what Dan is talking about is he's equating the for-profit misinformation, disinformation, lies that Purdue and other pharmaceutical companies put out there so that they could sell tons of drugs. That's what they did. They lied a bunch and they sold a bunch of drugs. And then people went, wait a second, this isn't what you said it is. And in the meantime, we had a massive explosion of opioid addiction. That's a very different thing than saying, because it's important to highlight here when we're talking about how that OxyContin was rolled out. It was said, hey, you know what? If you've got somebody who's taking chronic pain meds, if they're taking like a boatload of Tylenol, they don't need to take a boatload of Tylenol anymore. They can take this instead. This is a safe opioid for people to take. They can't possibly get addicted to it. As I said, that was a lie. But that is radically different. Prescribing drugs to somebody who has never been on opioids, who isn't dealing with regular opioid use or regular opioid addiction. That is radically different than saying, hey, here's a person who is regularly using opioids, who is addicted to opioids. And make no mistake, there is a safe supply that exists for opioids. Opioids are regularly prescribed in moderation and in care. They're regularly used, and they come from the pharmaceutical industry. As with all things, the thing that makes it dangerous is not the drug itself, it's how it's used and the frequency with which it's used, and most importantly, the quality of how that it's presented with. The problem that we see on the streets is that there's no quality control to the opioids that people are trying to use. The idea behind safe supply is to say, hey, you know what? People are going to use these drugs. They're going to get their hands on what they believe to be opioids, no matter what, because they're addicted to them. And if you've never seen anybody who's had to navigate opioid withdrawal or dope sickness, it is absolutely brutal and it can be fatal. So there's a lot of reasons why people who are addicted to opioids are pursuing a supply of opioids. They will either get it off the street, or as safe supply proponents argue, perhaps if we provided them with pharmaceutical grade opioids, they wouldn't be getting exposed to all of the rest of the toxic shit that's in the supply that keeps killing people. Two totally different things. To equate what Purdue did with what safe supply advocates are doing is either profoundly disingenuous or a demonstration of a complete lack of knowledge of what the topics of actually are. And, you could go either way, because Dan later doubled down when the question came up about toxic supply.
Minister, I wonder if you can acknowledge, though, that not everybody who dies from drug poisoning is an addict. Like, I could go downtown right now and buy some drugs. I'm not a drug user, but I could use drugs right now, and if the drug is poison, I would die, but I'm not a drug addict. So just to follow up on what Lisa's asking, what are you going to do for people right now? Right now. Maybe they're not ready to go into recovery.
So could I understand which drug you're proposing you buy?
I'm just saying any drug. Like any
Which drug?
I don't know. I'm not a drug user, but I'm just saying if I went down to...
Go on.
I'm not a drug user, but I'm saying if I went downtown to buy a drug and it was poisoned, not a non-prescription, an illegal drug that's on the streets, if I was to buy
an illegal drug, say fentanyl perhaps.
Yeah.
Okay, if fentanyl is poisonous.
Yeah, but Minister, the problem is that drugs are laced with poisonous substances.
I think that fentanyl and opioids are dangerous. They are addictive, and they result in death regularly, whether you're using hydromorphone or Oxycontin, which is the point of today's news release and legislation, is that it caused mass addiction. That addiction led to huge harms to our system.
So you're saying that only addicts die from drug poisoning? Is that what you're saying?
All illegal drugs that you consume are going to harm you, and that they are poisonous and toxic. This distinction between some drugs are toxic and some are not, whether you're talking about...
That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that it has to do with the person itself. That the person who uses drugs for the first time, illegal drugs for the first time, it might be poisoned and they die.
I'm saying yes, because illegal drugs are poisonous.
Keep referring to addiction and recovery. So that's what I'm trying to understand here.
Can we just let the minister respond to your question?
My position is that hydromorphone, used recreationally, fentanyl, carfentanil, and I'll even expand it beyond opioids and talk about methamphetamine, that they're dangerous, that they result in death when used, and that we should not encourage that. I hope that's helpful.
So Dan was very clearly doing his very best. Somebody watched the Pierre Poilievre Apple video and they were feeling their oats. They thought they'd give it a try for themselves. And yet he managed to demonstrate that he doesn't have a clue what it is he's talking about. Fentanyl is poisonous, says the Minister of Mental Health and Addictions in the province of Alberta, except it's not. Fentanyl is not poisonous. Fentanyl is used regularly in a variety of medical procedures across North America and the world. Fentanyl in a high enough dose can absolutely be dangerous. But fentanyl as a drug is not toxic. To say nothing of the fact that just because a drug's illegal doesn't necessarily make it toxic and going to kill you. There have been periods in time when alcohol has been illegal. There have been periods of time just recently where marijuana was illegal. People do die from alcohol overdoses, but it's not a whole lot of record of literally anyone dying from a marijuana overdose. I mean, they maybe get a little bit of munchies, and then maybe they throw up all over everything and feel really terrible for a while. But the reality is, people don't, saying that just because a drug is illegal means that it's fatal is absolutely incorrect. And demonizing drugs like fentanyl and saying that it is the fentanyl that's killing people, when all of the evidence is currently, right now, it's not that it's the fentanyl that's killing people. It's all of the other stuff that's in the supply. It's the unknown doses of fentanyl that people are taking. It is the inability to access if only there was a term for it, like, I don't know, safe supply that wasn't filled with toxic ingredients, because drug dealers are trying to pad out exactly how much supply they have so they can get the most for their bottom dollar. But the reality is, as that reporter was asking, somebody who's not a drug addict can go out on the streets. They can buy what they believe is, it doesn't matter what drug. And if that drug is laced with toxins, if it's not what they expected, if it's not what the people that they're using it with expected, if it's not what they're prepared for, that's when people die. And somebody who has no addiction whatsoever can absolutely die on their first exposure to a toxic drug supply. It's incredibly unfortunate that Mr. Williams is approaching something that should be managed using evidence-based medicine with a purely ideological, clearly misinformed bent. And that brings us to our next bill. Moving on to Bill 4. Bill 4 is the Tax Statutes Amendment Act, and it's super boring. It's an omnibus bill. It changes a couple of things. Basically, what the primary thrust of the bill is it makes sure that the fuel tax is extended. It legislates the extension of the provincial fuel tax pause to December 31st, 2023, so we get another 2 months out of it. It changes, repeals some changes. Remember how we were talking about how if you wanted to change a law, all you had to do was repeal it? That's one of the things that this bill does. It repeal changes that come into effect on July 1st, 2023, requiring online brokers, Airbnb, to collect and remit the tourism levy. The changes would be repealed retroactive to that date. So folks like Airbnb and Vrbo don't have to collect and remit the tourism levy anymore. They removed that part of the law. The legislative rule respecting Alberta's application of a measure announced in 2021 federal budget that allows eligible businesses to immediately deduct up to $1.5 million of the cost of eligible investments rather than expensing them over several years. It's a boring bill. That's all that it is. Brings us to Bill 5, the Public Sector Employers Amendment Act. And this is another one that's just, frankly, kind of boring. The act enables Alberta's government to replace the current outdated model for regulating non-union compensation with a new model that would alleviate challenges public sector employers have been facing for years, recruiting and retaining staff, because the current regulations do not account for inflation or evolving labor market conditions. So basically, what it's trying to do is set up standards to ensure that if you work in the public sector but you don't have a union to advocate for you, you won't get screwed on your wages quite so much. That's what Bill 5 is. But that brings us to the shit show bill, if you will. We're going to talk about Bill 6 for a second here, because this one is certainly more than a little bit problematic. Bill 6 is... got to brace myself here. I got some strong feelings about Bill 6. So what Bill 6 does is it takes a look at what happened during the pandemic, what happened during COVID. If you've been paying attention to what has been going on with some of the court cases that have been going on around COVID, around the health restrictions, one of the big things that happened was all of the health measures that were brought into place were declared invalid. And they were declared invalid because through court cases, it was revealed that rather than the chief medical officer of health making the decisions and saying, okay, using evidence-based medicine, here's what we need to do to keep the population safe. Rather than doing that, the government said to the health minister, hey, how about you give us some options, and then we'll go ahead and we'll choose which ones we like. Now, there were a lot of people who had some very big concerns about the way that this bill was being rolled out. Not the bill, sorry. The way that the health restrictions and the health measures were being rolled out, because it was very, very clear. There was no proof at the time, but it was clear to a lot of people that the decisions that were being made weren't being made by the chief medical officer of health, Dr. Dina Henshaw. They were rather being directed by Jason Kenney and by the health ministers and by the cabinet, which isn't how the law was written. The law in Alberta was written to say that in the event of a public health emergency, it's the chief medical officer of health who needs to be making the decisions, because politicians, most of them, didn't go to med school. And asking people who are under incredible public pressure by nature of the position that they hold to make informed, intelligent, evidence-based decisions when they don't have years of medical training that teaches them to be dispassionate about factors that don't necessarily, nor should they necessarily, influence these sorts of decisions. Asking public officials, asking elected officials to do that is just ridiculous, because they're getting the phone calls from angry people who also don't have the medical training. It's kind of like that cartoon where you see the one guy on the plane raise his hand and say, who's had it of these pilots and thinking that they're better than all of us at knowing how to fly the plane? I say that we take over. It's that same mentality. There are certain fields that have expertise and require expertise. Acknowledging that isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. But Mr. Kenney, known for his micromanagement during the pandemic, it's very clear Mr. Kenney was making the political decisions, not the evidence-based, science-based decisions. And so the court said, hey, that's not how the laws are supposed to work. That because you didn't follow the laws, all of those health orders that you issued are void. They're not valid because you did them illegally. One would think that if you were going to look at that situation and go, oh man, there were so many mistakes that happened during the pandemic because there were political decisions that were made as opposed to medical decisions that were made. Gosh, can you imagine if we made actual medical science-based decisions? We would, we would have dealt with that pandemic so much quicker. We would have dealt with it so much better. We would have better options for making sure that people's lives and livelihoods were better protected. Oh, the things that we could have done if we just things based on evidence and science. And then you would remember, oh, wait, Danielle Smith's our premier, and you would come to Bill 6. Because what Bill 6 does is it says, during a declared state of public health emergency, medical officers of health, including the chief medical officer of health, retain final decision-making authority for orders impacting a specific person or a specific public place. So if we get like a typhoid Mary, if you will, who's spreading disease, then the CMOH can say, we have to stop her from doing that, or him from doing that. So we're going to, I don't know, put him in a box or something. That's not what would happen. Or if there's a specific public place, like, I don't know, a kitchen that's been serving up E. coli-laced food to a bunch of kids, then the chief medical officer of health could say, yeah, we're shutting down that kitchen. That's totally unacceptable. Where's the change? Cabinet will have discretionary authority to make final decisions on public health orders in respect of all persons or groups of persons, including groups of individuals, businesses, nonprofits, and educational settings. The chief medical officer of health can still provide advice for cabinet and cabinet committees' consideration. So the little, air quotes, little decisions, those remain the purview of the chief medical officer of health, because they only affect a small number of people. A small number of people aren't going to get that angry, right? But if we're talking about large numbers of people who maybe might get angry, that's a lot of phone calls and emails to have to deal with during a crisis. That's where all of the decisions will be made by the politicians with zero background in epidemiology, virology, public health, medicine, pharmacology, you name it. It's hard to imagine a worse policy. And to put it under the guise of, we wanted to clear up the confusion. Let's be clear. There was no confusion. There was gross government overreach. And if you want to look at the court decision, there's almost no way to interpret it other than, hey, if you give politicians the ability to make decisions, they'll screw it up. So in Alberta, we're going to give politicians the ability to make all of the decisions, I guess. What could go wrong? Now, in order to make sure that we're not misrepresenting things, we're going to have us a conversation in the next little bit with somebody who's been on the show before, who is a bit of a specialist in legal stuffs involving public health and healthcare. We're going to have us an interview coming up next week, not this Wednesday, but the following Wednesday, with none other than Dr. Lorian Hardcastle. And that's going to be such a fun conversation, because either she's going to tell me that I am unbelievably wrong, or it will just be a very depressing conversation. I really, really, really hope I'm wrong. The other bill that is we're going to potentially see come through the legislature is a private member's bill. It's Bill 201. It is the Alberta Healthcare Insurance Access Fees Amendment Act, and it changes some wording to say that it would be illegal for people to charge access fees. And we've certainly seen some clinics that are trying to get away with that. So it's understandable why this bill would be brought forward. It's being brought forward by an NDP MLA. So there's that. Moving on from there. This is where things start to get a little bit hotter. That was a heating oil joke. You're welcome. The federal government went and made themselves a little bit of a decision recently. They made the decision to pause the carbon tax on home heating oil for 3 years. Now, a lot of people looked at this as a vote buying exercise, because one of the biggest areas that's going to reap benefits from this is the Maritimes, where the federal Liberals haven't been doing so great lately. And one of the other things that people have heavily criticized this decision for is when it was originally announced, it was tied to affordability. And that presents a problem for the whole idea of the carbon tax. The whole idea of the carbon tax is that it's A, supposed to be revenue neutral, and B, people who are making lower incomes are the ones who are supposed to be not only getting back what they pay in carbon tax, But when you get to the lower incomes, they're actually getting back more than what they pay in carbon tax. So to tie it to affordability and say that they were making this change to the carbon tax and putting this 3-year pause on carbon tax for home heating oil because of affordability issues calls into question, hey, but I thought that the carbon tax was giving people more money than they were paying for it, and I thought that it was revenue neutral, and what's going on with that policy of yours? And a lot of people have been very, very critical of it for those two reasons. But there's some folks who have done the inevitable, what about me? What do I get? And there's a couple of things that are important to take into context here. One of the things that's important to take into context is when it comes to the amount of carbon that's emitted, carbon dioxide that's emitted from house warming materials, when you compare something like natural gas to home heating oil pumps out way more carbon. That's also probably one of the reasons why the federal government has rolled out a program where they're going to be heavily subsidizing people who want to get heat pumps. Heat pumps are a different way of heating and cooling your home. It's actually some pretty cool tech. It's got some limitations when it gets into super cold climates, but there's even heat pumps that are good to minus 35. And when you get below there, you need to make use of some electric heating, but it removes the need for using natural gas or home heating oil. So it makes sense that people who are using home heating oil to transition them to something like heat pumps. There's a very good argument for that. But there's some problems. Because when you take a look at the provinces that mostly use the home heating oil, you're talking about the Maritimes, you're talking a little bit about Ontario, and you're talking about BC. But of course, BC has its own carbon tax. They're not part of the federal carbon tax program. And so this doesn't apply to them. The BC government could certainly turn around and say, hey, you know what? The feds are doing this. We're going to do this too. We saw Premier Scott Moe say, oh, we're going to tell the people who do the power not to collect carbon tax anymore, which is going to be fascinating to watch unfold because that's literally tax evasion. Not paying federal taxes is very bad. We've got a whole conversation coming up this week with economist and legal knower of things guy, Dr. Andrew Leach, where we get into that. Definitely don't want to miss it. It's a really good conversation. But there's that what about me that's been going on. Now, some people have said, what about me? I'd like to see some reductions as well. But then there's some other people who have said some other things.
I just did another interview following a Liberal MP from Alberta who was telling me that I should take policy seriously. So something just came to me, and I'll share it with you too. I think Alberta should pursue a subsidy where we will help if Albertans want to convert from natural gas to home heating oil. Maybe we'll help with one-time costs to pursue that. If this is such sharp policy, maybe we should follow suit.
Well, I mean, it's only a 3-year exemption, or so they say, and there's actually more people outside of Atlantic Canada. When you look at the people in Ontario, the North, and Western Canada, I know it doesn't apply to Alberta in any meaningful way, who burn home heating oil, if you look at the math provided. So it is a national program. I take your point, though, politically, this was driven by concerns in Atlantic Canada, and that's what caused this to happen.
It is absolutely the craziest policy they could ever have. And that's why the more I think about it, I'm deadly serious about this subsidy to convert from natural gas to home heating oil. You can expect it to be coming.
Okay. Well, we'll have you back, Minister, when it gets to that point, because I think that would be another conversation worth having.
That would indeed be another conversation worth having. That is the finance minister for the province of Alberta saying that, hey, you know what? If the feds are giving a discount on home heating oil, never mind the fact that it's 4 times more expensive than natural gas, we're going to try to switch people over. And the scary thing about that moment on Power and Politics was nobody knows. There's been a lot of debate as to whether or not he was serious. There's been a lot of debate as to whether or not he was serious or whether or not he was joking. And no point did the interview did he say, no, I was messing around with you there. Ha ha. But the feds suck. At no point did he say that. He doubled down. He pointed his pen at the screen and said he was deadly serious, which is kind of alarming when you stop and think about it. Because if it was a bit, I mean, first of all, not very well executed. Second of all, he's the finance minister for the province of Alberta. Things that he says can have a direct influence on investment environments. They have a direct influence on investor confidence. And to just say, because the feds, not only are we going to cut off our nose to spite our face, we're taking the eyebrows too, and the lips, probably the whole face. That'll show them when they have to deal with all these faceless Albertans running around. Take that, Justin Trudeau. Finance minister for the province of Alberta. We're very serious. We're a very serious province. We should be taken seriously. Which brings us to the main event. This weekend, in the city of Calgary, the UCP had the largest AGM in the province's history for a political party. AGM standing for Annual General Meeting. This is the yearly get-together that all political parties have, where they say, hey, look, here we are. We should elect some board members and we should vote on some policies and it'll be fun. That's the thing that they did. Now, this AGM was out of the gates going to be a contentious one. It was going to be one that a lot of people were going to be paying very close attention to. And the reason for that is because of the organization Take Back Alberta. There's been a lot of conversation in the run-up to the AGM about how Take Back Alberta was engaging, if that's the word that you want to use. Fanning the flames might be another term you could use. The passions of rural Alberta. And they were going to bring rural Alberta to Calgary. And they showed up. By some counts, there were upwards of 3,700 delegates or individuals who showed up to the UCP AGM. They paid their tickets, they took the ride, and they got to vote on a bunch of different things. Now, this is where, before we get to the really horrifying stuff, this is where taking a look at the consistency. I don't want to say honesty, because that's probably lawsuit territory, but the consistency of messaging from the leader of Take Back Alberta, Mr. David Parker. A little while ago, back in, all the way back in October 19th, David Parker tweeted out, I have no desire to control the UCP. The grassroots will control the UCP. I have school board trustees to deal with. For anybody who's been paying attention to the show, we talked quite a bit about how David Parker has made a lot of threats towards school boards. He's made it very clear that his goal for the next 2 years is to ensure that at the next round of school board elections, which will be in 2025 with the municipal elections, he's going to do his very, very best to make sure that they push out the woke, I guess, and deal with all of the things that they think are happening in schools that aren't actually happening in schools. And we'll get more people like the Monique Lagranges who post the Nazi memes, presumably, because that's what you get when people who don't know what they're signing up for sign up for things. They just sign up for ideological reasons. What could go wrong? Well, Mr. Parker said, and he said it a couple times, he doesn't want to influence the outcome of the AGM. He certainly wouldn't be calling, any emergency Zoom meetings. Oh, wait, he did, in fact, call an emergency Zoom meeting running up last week into the AGM. Tonight, we'll be holding an emergency meeting on Zoom for Take Back Alberta. I love this sentence. This is not an emergency in the sense that we're worried. Think of it more as an urgency. than an emergency. So we're going to call it an emergency meeting. We could call it an urgent meeting, but we're going to call it an emergency meeting, but don't actually think of it as an emergency meeting. It's everything's fine. Everything is fine. We just really need to have this conversation. If you'd like to attend, please contact your captain. We will be discussing our voting strategy, the policy proposals, and what we have accomplished as an organization so far. And he included the recommendations for an organization that doesn't want to influence the outcome. They included recommendations for governance resolutions. So their policy debate was split into two things. There were the governance resolutions, which are sort of how the party conducts its business. And then there's the policy resolutions. So he had a boatload of resolutions that he provided for governance. And for the guy who doesn't want to control the party, he also included a boatload of recommendations for the policy resolutions. And there were a lot of policy resolutions that popped up. We talked about a bunch of them on previous episodes because they were just so. I think now is a good time to switch back to that graphic because they were just so terrible. There were some really horrifying, offensive policies that the UCP were bringing forward, and a lot of people looked at the policy resolutions and they said, hey, you know what? Can't be that bad. I mean, at the end of the day, what we tend to see with these policy conventions is a bunch of really crappy policies get brought forward. There's always, especially with the conservative circles, there's always some policies that are really, really gross. But it's not like they're going to be like deliberately leaning into the worst of the worst. It's not like Danielle Smith at her keynote speech before all of the voting for the policies would kind of set the tone or anything like that.
Every parent listening today to hear me loud and clear, parents are the primary caregivers and educators of their children. We cannot have a successful province or a successful society without strong and nurturing families. And regardless of how often the extreme left undermines the role of parents, I want you to know that parental rights and choice in your child's education is and will continue to be a fundamental core principle of this party and this government, and we will never apologize for it.
When did it become a position held by the extreme left that if kids are in environments where they aren't safe, they should be provided supports? When did it become a position held only by the extreme left that kids should be protected from bigoted, hateful views? When did it become a position held only by the extreme left that kids who are susceptible to violence, who are susceptible to abuse, for no reason other than who they are, should have the ability to access support and should have the right to be safe? When did that become a view that was held only by, as the Premier of Alberta just said, the extreme left? There's nobody, certainly nobody that I've ever had any conversations with. There's probably a couple of fringe examples or whatever, but there's always one or two in every party or every group who ruins it for everybody else. But there's no real movement advocating for, hey, you know what? We should be overly sexualizing children, or we should be showing kids inappropriate materials, or we should be trying to turn kids trans or gay or LGBTQ or whatever. There's no movement to do that. And in fact, if you have a conversation with anybody who is quite frankly brave enough to teach in an Alberta classroom right now, they're so overwhelmed they would not have the time, the energy, the resources to do any of those things. They don't have the resources to teach the materials that they've been told to teach more often than not. Anybody who spent any time talking with a teacher in any recent history knows teachers are completely overwhelmed. Teachers are in a crisis situation right now. There are classrooms in this province that have up as many as 48 students in them for one teacher. You think somebody who's got 48 students is going to be able to influence any of those kids for identity stuffs? Any teacher will tell you they'll just be happy if they can get those kids to do the work that the kids are supposed to do. How many parents at the end of summer are so relieved that their kids are going back to school? Because managing just the one or the two of them is an incredibly draining, rewarding, don't get me wrong, but it's draining, it's work, it's effort. Lots of parents feel that way. Teachers are taking dozens of those kids at a time. And that's not even to say or to speak of the amount of energy the teachers are having to provide because they don't have the supports that they need to make sure that kids who have special needs, whether it's kids who have ADHD or whether it's kids who have other developmental delays, or there's a whole list of things that cause teachers to have to try to give energy because those teachers want to see those kids succeed. The notion that in the midst of all of the maelstrom that teachers are having to deal with, they're somehow finding the time to mess with the family unit is incredibly disingenuous. It's incredibly misinformed. But it is the view that the Premier of Alberta decided to espouse before the policy votes that took place. And how did those policy votes turn out? Well, let's take a look at a few. Policy number 4. This is the one that talked about an individual's right to informed consent and the idea that nobody should ever be pressured into having to accept a medical intervention or procedure because of maybe a vaccine mandate or anything. Policy number 4 passed. Policy number 5, they didn't want to have digital currency, which is wild because when you take a the Venn diagram of the folks that are all crypto bros and at the same time wildly anti-vax, anti-science is pretty much just a big circle. Policy number 5 against digital currency passed. Policy number 8 requires teacher school boards to obtain the written consent of parent, guardian, and student under the age of 16 prior to changing the name or pronouns used by the student. That policy passed. Policy number 9. The United Conservative Government believes that the government of Alberta should ensure post-secondary institutions shall be places of free thought and learning of employable skills by eliminating all diversity, equity, and inclusion offices at public universities. Any post-secondary institution that maintains a DEI office, policy, or equivalent shall lose government financial support. That policy overwhelmingly passed. Policy 12. The United Conservative Government believes the government of Alberta should prohibit any land use or developmental planning initiatives that would restrict movement of residents per Section 6 of the Canadian Charter Rights and Freedoms. This is about 15-minute cities, which is the biggest nothing burger in the history of nothing burgers because it's all about making sure that the stuff that you need is within walking distance. The policy, number 12, against 15-minute cities, passed overwhelmingly. Policy 13, preventing concerns about electoral fraud by banning any electronic machine for tabulation or counting of ballots for any provincial election. We're going into the Dominion voting machines territory, which was disproven, but nonetheless here in Alberta, that policy overwhelmingly passed. Policy number 15. The United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should recognize that Albertans have many endangered God-given rights and freedoms that are not formally affirmed in the Canadian Constitution and its enactments or Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Things that should be formally recognized freedom of conscience, religion, thought, belief, opinion, and expression, freedom of the press, peaceful assembly and association. They want those expanded. Things that they want added in. The right to keep arms. We're talking gun rights. Let's get all American up in here. We want to add parents' rights. We want to add rights to self-defense, right to privacy of personal information and access to government information, swift due process for criminal and civil matters, and the right to marry and enter a civil union. The right to bear arms, passed in the province of Alberta, overwhelmingly. Policy number 16, protecting Alberta physicians from undue third-party influence, to neither compel physicians to prescribe treatments nor prohibit them from prescribing treatments, and to include the right of physicians to prescribe off-label medications using their best discretion with the informed consent of the patient. Now, what's wild about this one is this policy is clearly coming from the place of COVID-19, ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, the doctors who wanted to prescribe the things that have no medical evidence for working for these sorts of things, they should have been able to do that. But where it's wild is they didn't stop to think about the fact that they just wrote a policy that in effect endorses physicians being able to prescribe safe supply. Nonetheless, the policy, the ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine policy, overwhelmingly passed. Policy number 17. Support a comprehensive bill of parents' rights that ensures all legislation will recognize and support parents' rights to be informed and in charge of all decisions to do with all services paid by the province, including education and health care. Now, it's worth reiterating at this point, parents don't have rights. They're custodians of their children's rights. But apparently, that isn't enough. Knowing that you're responsible for protecting the rights of your child isn't enough. There's some folks who just want to take away the rights of their children and assert them themselves. Policy number 20. The United Conservative Government believes that the government of Alberta should ensure that teachers, school boards, and third parties providing services to kindergarten to grade 12 do not provide access to materials of a sexual, racist, or abusive nature, including but not limited to books, handouts, online materials, live events that are not part of Alberta program of schools. Buying into the conspiracy that kindergarten teachers are handing out inappropriate materials to children, which doesn't happen. But again, profoundly short-sighted, because anybody who has ever read, I don't know, the Bible knows everything that's listed in there is present in the Bible. But even bigger than that, literally almost every part of Canadian history has ties to a racist nature, has ties to abusive natures. So to say there shouldn't be any materials that contain any of these things is not just revisionist history, it's erasing history. And as the expression goes, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Policy 21. We're going to get back into the solar farms here. United Conservative Party believes the government of Alberta should not support the establishment of solar farms in the areas of Agriculture Canada Land Inventory Class 1, 2, or 3 soils. Never mind going back to where we started. Less than 0.1% of all agricultural land would be required to host a net zero solar future. Policy 22. We're almost getting to the ends of the really horrifying ones here. And provincial funding for supervised consumption sites, overwhelmingly passed. Policy 28. Now, this one's interesting. A little bit inside baseball here. But it makes the argument that people who are governed by professional bodies, whether it's medical colleges or law institutions or any of those sorts of things, they should only be able to be investigated by those colleges or associations for things they do while they're on the job. Overwhelmingly passed. And then just to make sure that the trans dog whistles were really, really heard, the United Conservative Party believes that the government of Alberta should protect inmates who are female at conception and housed at correctional and remand centres for women operated by Alberta Correctional Services by refusing to house any inmate who is male at conception at said correctional and remand centres, regardless of whether post-op or where they are in their transition. They're fully post-op. Let's just throw them in with the men and see what happens. What could possibly go wrong? And in fact, when we take a look at the entire UCP policy book, it is nothing but socially regressive policies that are by and large founded on fear and conspiracy theories. Every single policy passed save one. The only policy that didn't pass, and I wish I was making this up, was Policy 19 that argued that there should be a voucher system to ensure that education funding follows each student and enhances the vision of school choice. Why did that policy fail? I wish I was making this up, but I'm totally not. The reason that policy failed, the reason why that policy was voting down, is because the prevalence of homeschoolers at the UCP AGM overwhelmed the rest of the people there. By some estimations, it was a 55% vote that defeated that policy. And it was defeated because the homeschools didn't feel like they were represented in the voucher policy, which is pretty wild when you stop and think about it. There's a lot of people who have said the UCP was supposed to be the home for progressive conservatives as well as the not so progressive conservatives. The UCP was an experiment that was designed to bring in all people of conservative stripes under the same tent. This policy convention made it very, very clear that that experiment has unmitigatingly failed. Make no mistake, the party that is the UCP, the United Conservative Party, is nothing more than a revved up, supercharged version of the Wild Rose. And this was very obvious by the number of people who didn't attend. There are some conservative heavy hitters, progressive conservative heavy hitters who have been heavily involved in the conservative movement in the province of Alberta who no-showed at this event. The resistance to this litany of socially regressive policies that are, by and large, addressing things that don't even exist speaks to the culture that now exists inside of the United Conservative Party. I've said it before. Watching Jason Kenney head into his leadership review and his shock at the results and his decision to resign, it was very much like watching a kid who had been playing with matches right beside the drapes all of a sudden watch the drapes go up in flames and then leave the house. Jason Kenney, when he came to Alberta to unite the right, unquestionably leaned in and courted the far right, the conspiracy theorists, because he wanted to get rid of the vote split and ensure that conservatives would be able to reassert their dynasty in Alberta provincial politics. But what he didn't account for was the more that you embolden extreme views, the more that those views inevitably assert themselves. We saw this during the pandemic, whereas the same people who campaigned for Kenney in the leadership and campaigned for Kenney in unity turned around and said, "Oh, I don't like this at all. This isn't very good. I'm going to go do rallies now. I'm going to go organize freedom marches. I'm going to go ignore all science and evidence. And I'm going to remove Jason Kenney from office because he dared to take away our freedoms." And by no means am I defending Mr. Kenney. It should be very, very clear, based on my rant from earlier about his interference with the defined powers of the Chief Medical Officer of Health. Not a lot of love lost. but he courted that extremism and he lost control of it. Now, where things start to get particularly fascinating is we might, for the first time, be starting to see some cracks in Take Back Alberta. Earlier, I showed you a couple of graphics from the Take Back Alberta folks that were written and produced and provided by the leader of Take Back Alberta. It's worth noting on the policy resolutions, he had over a dozen policies that he encouraged the Take Back Alberta folks to vote against. David Parker provided rationales for why these policies, some of these policies, are so bad and were counterproductive. In fact, Mr. Parker even recognized that when they were talking about the or advocating for freedom of treatment, he even recognized that that would potentially open the door to safe supply. He recognized that the policy about material in schools would ban classic books. David Parker tried to say, it appears, through these recommendations, hey, you know what, guys? I get that, boy, we're angry. Oh, we're extremely angry, and we're the grassroots, and we're going to do a grassroot and tootin' time here at this AGM. But we really should think about what we're doing here because we might be making some mistakes. And it seems like David Parker, who campaigned for Jason Kenney in the original unity effort, might be starting to emulate Jason Kenney a little bit. Because what we've been told is that at last year's AGM, David Parker was able to effectively dictate which policies were approved and which ones weren't. Looking at the policies that he said people should not vote for and weighing that against the reality that every single policy passed with the exception of the school vouchers one because the homeschoolers felt left out. I'm not going to get tired of saying that. I don't think, horrifying though it is, that's the reality. So maybe David Parker is now sitting at the bottom of the drapes, slowly watching the flames starting to climb up them as well. The question that's going to be fascinating to see is, does David Parker, who pontificates on social media at length, tells people how he's so much better than them, whether or not that apparent narcissism is going to allow him to get out of his own way, or if he's going to burn down with the house too? And that's the end of our AGM segment. But don't worry, as promised last week, we've got our regular segment. We're going to do this every week now because we've got the material for it. So why the hell not? Welcome to our regular segment, Stuff Danny Says. That's we put that little intro together this week. I love the dance mix hits at the end there. Welcome to Stuff Danny Says. Danielle Smith had a busy week this week. Not only did she have her AGM, but she made the rounds on the press conferences. She made the rounds on the talk shows. Now, we're going to start with a press conference that she did where she was again asked the question about why are power supply or why are electricity prices so very high. Now, despite the fact that a couple months ago, Danny was able to answer that question quite coherently and say, it's this economic withholding thing. It's allowing power producers to hold back some of the supply and then dictate the prices. We're going to fix it. Yeah, it was an old policy thing. Blame Kenny. She tried to answer the same question again this week, but it's very clear that percolating in the back was that big speech that she was going to was being delivered at the throne speech, because the answer that she gave this week was much more salady.
On a slightly unrelated topic, Premier, you've spoken out against economic withholding in our provincial electricity system, saying, quote, I think too much power is being held back, prices are escalating too much, and we're all paying the price for it, end quote. As Albertans head into winter and prices for electricity remain high, will you eliminate economic withholding during this legislative session?
That discussion will be part of the overall package of reforms that we put in place when the pause comes off. Is that we have to make sure that everybody is participating fairly in the market. And I think that we have seen, and I understand why economic withholding occurs, because when wind and solar come on strong at zero, certain companies hold back power until it gets to a certain rate so that they can then come in economically. I understand how the market works, but it's a backward market. It doesn't make much sense for it to work that way, and it gives perverse incentives. So the regulator did affirm that economic withholding was allowed, I think, in a 2020 decision. And I think it was because up to that point, they hadn't seen any issues of the market being distorted as a result of that. But ever since that decision, we've seen massive distortions in the market. And so I've already asked Minister Neudorf to be consulting on that and how we might remedy that. So that is going to be part of the package of reforms.
At this time, do you see any downsides in eliminating it?
Well, the problem that we have, and again, this is the strange way in which this market has been created. Part of having an energy-only market is that the players will say they have to have a higher rate for a sustained period of time to earn enough capital so that they can pay off their capital costs, have enough money to invest in new. And there was a discussion years ago about a capacity market, which would be allowing us to pay people for being on standby for us. The decision was made at that time not to go forward with that, but I think we're beginning to see the consequences of what happens when there isn't a mechanism to bring on new baseload power, is that we don't end up with new baseload power projects being proposed. So that's what we're trying to fix in this whole process, because in order to bring on more wind and solar, we have to bring on more baseload. They have to happen in tandem so that we're not facing power outages on our coldest days and our hottest days. And so we need to make sure that we've created a market that allows for more of that baseload to come in, and we don't have that right now. So there's a number of things that need to be remedied, and we'll have all of those answers by the end of February when the pause comes off.
I love that clip so much. It's the solar, don't you see? It's the economic withholding is to deal with the solar. This is why the solar is so bad, the solar and the wind, when the sun doesn't blow and the wind doesn't shine or something. There's words that I'll use. And also economic withholding is largely because corporations like to make a lot of money. That's the bottom line. That's what it is. And they've been allowed to do that because of the UCP government. It's fascinating that Danielle Smith and the UCP will move incredibly quickly to address things like the fuel tax. But when it comes to a single policy that is unquestionably costing Albertans tremendous amounts of money, we'll get to it. There'll be some things coming down the road. Certainly not going to be in this legislative session, which puts it into the spring session. So for the people who are just holding on with their fingernails, I guess hold on harder. But then we get to Danielle Smith's appearance on Real Talk. That one was just for you, Dave. Danielle Smith appeared on Real Talk with Ryan Jesperson on November 1st, 2023, starting off the new month strong. And there's some clips that we'd like to play from that. The first one we're going to talk about, she's complaining about the ethics commissioner and the fact that the ethics commissioner has said to her, you should probably try to behave ethically. This conversation basically stems out of the fact that Danielle Smith was told that she wasn't allowed to hang out in the elite boxes at hockey games or sporting events for extended periods of time. There was a cap of time that you could spend in those elite owners boxes and oil and gas boxes. You can't just hang out there with those big oil execs and enjoy the entire game from a place that the average Albertan would never be able to get to see. But the conversation took some fascinating turns.
I have to tell you, I want to be respectful of the position, but there are certain things that we have been told are that I cannot do. For instance, during the stampede, I was told I could only be in the suites for 20 minutes at a time. When I receive ribbon skirts as a matter of protocol, it's been questioned whether I'm allowed to keep them. They're probably only valued at $40. Been told I can't do dishes in my husband's restaurant, even though I'm volunteering to do that. So I just have to say that I think that there are some tweaks we may need.
So, in that brief little clip, Danny said quite a few things. First of all, there's an expression that if you use the word "but," it invalidates whatever came before it. I want to respect the position, but there's just some things that I don't like about it. She's talking about her role as premier, of course. But then she goes on to list some examples where she thinks she's been treated unfairly. The question is to whether or not she's allowed to keep ribbon skirts. Now, for anybody who's not familiar, ribbon skirts are skirts that are traditionally handcrafted by First Nations and Indigenous peoples. They are tremendously significant gifts. And even if you take a look at the cost of the materials, they're worth well more than $40. But if you think that you can just go out and pick up a handcrafted ribbon skirt that has been specifically made for an individual for $40, you're deluding yourself. Especially when these are presented as gifts from Indigenous and First Nations people. To just dismiss them as like, they're only worth $40. I don't see what the big deal is incredibly disrespectful to the significance that a gift of that type represents. But then she talked about the restaurant. Now, some of you might remember a few months ago, Danny posted a picture of herself working away, washing dishes in the restaurant. And there were a lot of questions about the picture because there were some people argued there were some pretty significant health violations that were going on in the picture. But where it got really scandalous, well, before it got even really scandalous, there are some people who said, hey, you know what? I'm not sure how I feel about the premier of the province using her official social media, which we've established is her official social media, because there is a company that is being contracted and being paid with taxpayer dollars to run that social media account. So it's no question that it's Danielle Smith's official taxpayer-funded social media account. This is one of the reasons why she had to unblock the entire province after we released the results of our FOIP. A lot of people are like, that's not appropriate to be pumping your husband's restaurant using your official government account. That doesn't seem ethical, doesn't seem right. But it got even worse when 2 days later it was revealed that they had just put the restaurant up for sale. Apparently the restaurant hasn't sold yet, but a lot of people said, you know what, she's just washing restaurants. It's just a pick. Well, it turns out the ethics commissioner felt that it was egregious enough that she was told, you can't do that anymore. That's not okay. So again, we have somebody who's in the role of premier of the province having to be reminded of what's ethical and what's not, because she clearly doesn't have a firm grasp of that on her own. But Mr. Jesperson asked some other questions. And in particular, he asked about the pension survey.
Why doesn't the online survey on the Alberta pension plan give a very simple question? Number one option, do you want this or not? Why not start there?
Well, that's what the referendum question would be if we move to that. We're in the phase of trying to tell people what the plan would look like. And so the first stage was doing the LifeMark report.
Again, it's fascinating to me, truly fascinating to me, that Danielle Smith is able to get up in front of multiple media sources She's able to get up in front of multiple different venues and say the wrong name for the report that she's using to justify this $8 million expenditure. It's LifeWorks. It's not LifeMark. It's LifeWorks. She's been doing this for weeks, where she continues to say the wrong name for the report. And either her staff are so incompetent that they're not able to communicate in such a way that lands with Danny, hey, maybe if we're going to try to be credible, you should get the name of the report right. Or despite their best efforts, let's assume that her comms staff, the people who are coaching her, are in fact competent. They're very good at their jobs. Let's go down that possible. Then that means that despite the fact that she has a competent comms team coaching her, she's not able to internalize the name of the report herself. That's super comforting too. So no matter which way you cut it, it's not a great look. But it's a bit of a departure of the messaging. Because when the $8 million taxpayer-funded advertising campaign was first launched, it was introduced as, it's consultation. We want to hear from Albertans. We want to know what Albertans are thinking. And the report was quickly panned. The survey was quickly panned. People who are experts at surveys and engagement took a look at it and said, this thing's hot garbage. You're not trying to get feedback. You're trying to shape people's opinions. That's not what you said you were trying to do at all. And it appears that Danny and the UCP have completely abandoned the whole idea that this is about consultation. This is about hearing what Albertans want. This is $8 million being spent on telling Albertans, educating Albertans as to why this is such a great idea. Now, it's worth remembering, all of this is happening at the same time that Danielle Smith has acknowledged and then not acknowledged and then acknowledged and then not acknowledged that the numbers that come out of the LifeWorks report are, in fact, maybe not the concrete numbers. Now, the good news is the federal government has announced that they are going to have their folks take a look and see what the numbers are. But the bad news to that is there's a lot of people, myself included, who are expecting Danielle Smith to quickly turn around and go, aha, you see, they lowballed us. We wanted 53%. They're saying we could only have 16. Oh, the feds, with their always trying to screw us. Everybody should be very angry at them. That's going to be the tack that Smith and the UCP unquestionably take, but we'll get to see some potential numbers. Nonetheless, the consultation continues to move on as taxpayers' money can just be, I guess, thrown out the window and put on fire. But there's one more clip that we want to play before we wrap up our Stuff Danny Says segment, and that's where she weighed in about trades.
News about fast-tracking trades workers from grade 10 into the trades, into vocational schools. Is that accurate? Are you seriously thinking about that?
I met with a woman who was a homeschool mom who came from the UK. She said they have 2 credentials in the UK, A levels and O levels. And she put the idea to me, why don't we have the ability to get a grade 10 certificate so that those kids could go right into a community college program? And I thought, we should look into whether or not we can do that. So I've asked Dimitrios Nicolaides to have it.
Do you worry about the optics of that? Do you worry about the development of young people? Do you worry about Alberta's reputation?
I worry about young people who are not going to go on to university, sitting in a classroom being made to feel like they're just not up to it because they don't have the academics to be able to finish grade 11 and grade 12. And then they sit in despair and not know what their direction is for 10 years until they find a trades program. The average age of somebody entering the trades program is 27. Why can't we get those kids that connected to what they're meant to do in life at age 17? And I think we should be very proud of our trades. I think we should have a parity of esteem, and we should make sure that everyone knows that those jobs have great careers, great professions, and that we should celebrate every single one of them.
Now, here's the problem with Danny's approach. And we threw this out and heard back from a lot of people who work in the trades. The way that Danny's presenting it is she's talking about it like, hey, you know what? There's like a 16-year-old kid. He's in grade 10 and his marks are terrible. He can't do the academics. He can't wrap his head around the math and the physics and all of those kinds of things and the chemistry. And so, you know, boy, my heart just breaks for that kid. So instead of asking him or supporting him appropriately or supporting teachers or supporting the education system, what if we just moved him to the trades? What if we just said, hey, you know what? You can't do math or physics or chemistry. Why don't we put you in a profession where you don't have to do any of those things? Except here's the thing. If you've spent any time in the trades, if you talk to anyone who's spent any time in the trades, you need those skills. When you're talking about people who are doing the building of the things that the people use in order for those things to be safe, there's actually a fairly high level of understanding of math and physics, often chemistry, that a person has to bring to the table. There's a reason why trades programs take as long as they do in order for people to get the levels of accreditation that they want to get. It's because there's a lot going on there. And to talk about the trades, for the Premier of Alberta to, on one hand, talk about the trades like, hey, anybody who can't handle grade 11 or 12, they should just go to the trades, man. And at the same time say, people should respect the work that the trades do, as she's insulting the work and the skills and the credentials that people who work in the trades bring to the table is pretty wild. As always, we're going to end this segment of Stuff Danny Says with our very, 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 I can't speak for everybody here, but my very, very, very favorite clip that just always makes me feel better about everything. It's the second nod. I know I say that every time I play this, but it's the second nod.
BS detector evolved over time?
I tend to be pretty trusting.
I will never get tired of that. I will never, ever, ever, ever get tired of that clip. And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdown's audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.